All right. So we take the objectives, the terminal and key learning objectives that you've been seeing in these READMEs for the past several weeks, and we're really just highlighting the ones that are crucial for this first assessment, right? And it's going to line up with what you've already seen in the checklist document that I made for you last week. But with this repeated kind of exposure, you'll come to understand what are the more critical aspects of AWS versus what are the aspects that are just good to know for now that we can utilize later on. So things like the API gateway, CloudFront, you won't need to know that for your first certification. I do think they start to introduce those things to you at an associate level. But for now, the key things are the ones that we are exposing you to more than everything else. So that's going to be your EC2 instance, right? Because that's essentially the machine in which everything operates. You have your RDS, which is your database handling, your buckets, similar to RDS, but more so for files. And from there, we have policies through IAM, routing, VPCs are, I would categorize that under routing because while VPCs are kind of like the layer in which a lot of these instances coexist, it's the VPC that allows you to connect things like routing presets to subnets, to security groups, to NACLs, things like that. So with everything listed here, these are the key things that you'll need to remember. And hopefully with that, it will make things a little easier. You'll also have a lot of time. You'll have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to get the challenge done. And a lot of the challenge, everything in the challenge has been shown to you before in some of these assignments, some of these challenges leading up to this. Today, Lambdas will not necessarily be covered in the assessment. I'm trying to think if there's like an opportunity to even utilize Lambdas at all. I think even for like the optional stretch goals, there's not really great opportunities for Lambdas, but today's exercise will give you some exposure to not just AWS Lambdas, but packaging local files to push to AWS. And it'll give you some experience as well with setting up RDS and databases within RDS. So more practice on that. With that said, I'm going to switch over to very, very, very quick slide deck, just an introduction to Lambdas. It's a very short lesson, but don't let its simplicity fool you because there may be a lot of troubleshooting required for this one as well. It's sort of like your mileage may vary kind of situation because troubleshooting will stem from how your local environment is set up. And, that could vary greatly from person to person. So that may impact how you get the code that you have locally into AWS and functioning through the AWS Lambda. But before I get ahead of myself again, let me talk about what Lambdas are in the first place. And before I even do that, I want to ask actually, can anyone tell me or guess what they think an AWS Lambda is? Because we have talked about Lambdas before.
My understanding, they're just like serverless functions, right? Like you could run serverless functions of cloud.
Exactly. I think the name makes a lot of sense because when I think about Lambdas at like a broader level, I think about what Lambdas are in JavaScript, for example. That's like a syntax, right? That's a syntax for anonymous functions. It's a function that you don't have to define. It's a very simple expression and result and output. So that's what AWS Lambdas are in a nutshell, serverless functions. And the advantage to this, when you compare it to what you have in a traditional monolithic tech stack versus a series of microservices, is flexibility, right? Within a monolithic application, you have this kind of waterfall effect, right? You have to go from the front end to an API, to the back end, to the database, actually through another set of APIs in the back end before you get to the database, and then back up to the front end. Same thing with a microservice, but it can be a little more loose. You have more flexibility in a microservice, a series of microservices than you would with a monolithic application. But serverless functions is where you have the most flexibility, because from the get-go, you have this way to execute code that can connect to any part of your application, basically. You don't need to go through the front end necessarily, or the back end, or through any of these sequence of steps or events in order to call the function. There just has to be an event and a trigger. Now, there are disadvantages, of course, because nothing is ideal. On one hand, we have a simplified infrastructure management, right? Because the AWS Lambdas are designed to be simple to write. It's just code that gets executed. So the downside to that would be that there's a reliance on cloud infrastructure, because it's essentially something that exists solely in the cloud, solely in AWS. You're dependent on AWS's uptime. Usage-based costs. This could work in your favor. It could make things cheaper, but I don't think it's practical to always assume, for example, that it's always going to be cheaper, because it's not always going to be cheaper. It really boils down to how you design an application, right? Like, let's say you design an application and you're heavily reliant on Lambdas, and you have like these series of executions in this user journey that's just triggering Lambda after Lambda after Lambda. Those costs are going to add up. So I don't want to say off the bat that it's cheaper or more cost effective, but it can be if you understand the intent and the purpose, the advantage to its design, that it's usage-based. And that just is more appropriate in some cases than it would be in others. You have more immediate access. Again, you don't have to go through an entire flow in order to call this. You just need an event and a trigger. And in that regard, it's built to be scalable, right? And so that accessibility, that cross-functionality, that's what makes it flexible. But then let's think about some of these downsides. While it might be more immediately accessible, it's asynchronous, right? So that's going to mean there may be higher latency. You don't have strict separation of code where, like, within an application, you have, like, let's say, promises and awaits, right? Which themselves are asynchronous, but at least it's contained within the application. Whereas with AWS Lambdas, you have an application that could be calling this separate code, and that can lead to higher lag. That could be a slower response time for the end user as a result. It could definitely be more challenging to debug and troubleshoot, because the environment, the same thing that gives it the advantage of being immediately accessible, which is the separate environment. Yes, rate limits are a must. Very great point, Chad. The very things that make it advantageous in some ways are also what make it disadvantageous in other ways. So environment discrepancies. This is very likely what you're going to experience today. You'll have your local environment set up in a particular way. You may even have your application set up in a particular way. But then when it comes time to write a Lambda to get this to execute, you can't just, you would hope that you could simply copy and paste your code into this Lambda and have it work. But the environment is where things might get really sticky. So, like I've already mentioned, Lambdas are very simple functions. It's just code that gets executed, right? And pretty much just consists of a trigger and an event. The trigger is essentially what connects to the function. It's what decides what function to be called, and the event is what will initialize the trigger that invokes the function overall. Ooh, that slide did not get finished. I think I was going to talk about the elements of a Lambda here. And it's very simple. Like you'll have your descriptors. So you're going to be describing a name, a description of what it does. You'll be deciding what language you want this code to be written in, and that's going to determine the runtime. Does it run in a Linux environment, for example? And from there, you'll be able to set additional things like layers, which allow you to extend the environment. So you could actually do this in two different ways. Let's say your code is dependent on a custom library that is not inherently included in the OS that's installed, that's running your Lambda, right? So you're going to have to import that code somehow. You could do it by deploying your code as a complete package, or you could do it piece by piece. As you build upon your Lambda and you find that you need more and more dependencies, you could add these new modules and libraries and packages as layers. And we'll see how all of that works in today's demo. Any questions so far? Cool. So let me switch over to VS Code. Actually, I should have just kept it on the browser so I could show you. Wow, my screen is so cluttered and my spare monitor is not working, but let me share like this. Because I also want to show you in, what is it called? MySQL Workbench, this database and what's happening. So first, let me share my browser again. And what I want is my AWS console. So let me find that. Okay, so can y'all see this, AWS? Okay, I lost the chat. Where's the chat?
No, we can see it.
Cool, cool. Okay, so with Lambdas, you have a fairly simple interface. Right now, I have two existing Lambdas. And if I click on these, I see that there is a name. I didn't even give it a description. We're seeing that I used a package and not just written code. And we can see that there is a selected runtime. Let's actually click this. Let's go ahead and invoke this code. So we're going to go over to test. And in our test, we are able to edit this event JSON. And this is these are the parameters, the values, the arguments that you are going to be passing into your code, right? So right now I'm updating because I named this function create row. You could probably infer that I am creating a row in a database of names. I'm adding a first name and a last name. So this already exists. I already added this. So let's add a new name. I don't know, Fred Durst. We were talking about Limp Bizkit just about an hour ago. So Fred Durst. If I go, actually, let me show you, before I trigger this, let me show you MySQL Workbench. So we could see what the database currently looks like. Okay. Are you all, did it switch? Nope. Man, I feel like such a boomer with technology sometimes. Okay. All right, MySQL Workbench. I am connected to my database that is currently existing inside of an RDS instance. If I run a very simple select all statement, I see that the only row in this table right now is Forrest Gump. So appreciate it, Nico. All right, let's see. So now let's switch back to VS Code and let's take a look at this function being executed. So I'm going to hit test. And I'm going to click on details, and I'm going to see that my row was successfully inserted. And if we go back to MySQL Workbench, I will run this query again. And now we have Fred Durst in our database. Cool, right? Easy. Looks very easy, right? We'll see how easy it is. You'll see how easy it is today. So let's look at creating a new Lambda and what that looks like, because it is deceptively simple. When you create a new Lambda, it asks you if you want to author from scratch, use a blueprint, use a container image. We're only going to worry about authoring from scratch today. I'm going to give it a name, like let's say, I don't know, update row. And you're going to choose your runtime. In my case, I'm probably going to want some consistency. I've already selected Python 3.11 for my first Lambda, so I will select 3.11 again. Permissions. Don't worry about creating a new role. There should be an existing role that will work for all of you. So if you go to use existing role, you'll find Lambda lesson. That should have the proper permissions. Let me know if it doesn't, but that should. Advanced settings. We can leave all of this unchecked. And that's all you need to create your Lambda at first. Once it's created, you'll have access to it. You'll be taken right to it. And from here, you can see that you could write code. We can see a very simple script right now. It is called Lambda handler, and that's how it's going to be called when we run a test, and it's going to execute. It's going to return our string saying hello from Lambda. So let's go ahead and test that. When you create a test, sorry, when you hit test, you're going to have to create one first. So in this case, we're just going to say test message because we're testing the message. Don't worry about an event JSON because as you saw with the code, we're not actually using this right now. So none of this matters for now. So let me save this and then I can invoke it. And now I can see my response. Got a status code of 200 and this value was returned. All right. So again, so far, so good, looking very easy. Where it gets complicated is when you start to add complexity to it, right? So first off, if we go back to my other function, create row, and we go to our code tab, notice that I am no longer able to see the editor for editing my code because I've already uploaded a zip file. And if somebody can find where you would go to get rid of the zip file and get the editor back for your code, let me know because I am dying to find out.
I've spent too much time to not know how to do it now, Julius, so I can help you with that.
Right on.
It's using layers, but so like for me, my layers, like I put all my dependencies in my layers. And so the only thing that I have for my code is the package that I zip up is just the py file. And then I keep all the dependencies out of that. And then you'll be able to see your code and edit it and make your changes.
Smart.
But like when I've made my dependency layers, it's worked 9 out of 10 times. One time it didn't work and I can't fix that Lambda. So, but yeah, I can show you that later if you want.
Yeah, for sure. that would definitely come in handy. As we can see right now, I've got 3 layers for 3 different packages. MySQL, which you're going to use if you want to create a MySQL database, and Scicop G2, because I was trying to get it to connect with a Postgres database, but I was running into a lot of issues. So we'll have to switch over to my VS Code to see the code. Before we do that, well, no, we'll do RDS at the very end. So let me switch over to VS Code. Okay. I go to, whoops, I closed the wrong file. Go to my Lambda function. What I had currently was an import statement. I'm first importing my MySQL library. So what Chad suggested was actually pretty clever. By separating your code from all the dependencies, you don't have to worry about what I was struggling with earlier, and that was getting the imports just right? So with Scicop G2 specifically, we've talked about Scicop G2 before, how you'll have the choice of not only between Scicop G2 and Scicop G3, but then you have Scicop G2 versus the Scicop G2 binary. You have Scicop G3 versus Scicop square brackets binary. And from there, you have different distributions. So you might have one package that is designed to work on a certain version of Linux, or one that's more that's using a certain style of Python. And these things were causing me a lot of grief, because whenever I zipped up my code and pushed it to AWS, I ran my test and I would get the error module not found, which is a pain. But if you do what Chad suggested, it may be a lot easier to troubleshoot, because you don't have to continually redeploy your application, updating your import statements and reinstalling your pip files, right? But however you go about it is up to you. So in my case, what I had was a folder created for my project. And within this folder, I wanted to create a virtual environment, because I like to use virtual environments. So let me activate my virtual environment again. And now I'm in my virtual environment. If I run pip, let's do pip, it's pip version, right? Or is it pip which? I'm going to do a pip version on MySQL. Whoops. Let's try pip 3. Is it pip which?
I'm trying to look it up now.
Pip show?
If you put which in
I
front
know
of
there's
it, does that work?
All right.
I know there's pip list, but I think it might list all of them. Yeah, but it has the versions.
That works. All right, so we could see that these are what I have in my virtual environment. And so I've got a few different versions of Scicop G2. Well, 4, I guess, if you include Scicop G. And where is MySQL? Surprised I don't see it. But that was the flow that I decided to go with. So I imported MySQL into, I'm really curious about this now, into my my script, which is lambda underscore function. Notice how it's the exact same code. Well, actually, no, you couldn't see the code in AWS, but you saw when we created a new Lambda, it was also called Lambda handler. So we're still using the same method, and we're just updating the script to have some additional information, right? So I have, for example, the RDS database information that I'm going to need in order to connect to that database. So the endpoints from the RDS, the username, the password, the name of the database, these are the things that you configure when you set up your RDS. From there, I have very simple variables. I'm grabbing the columns, I'm grabbing the values and the keys to use as columns or to pass into my database as columns, right? So when you saw earlier in the event.json, it was a very simple JSON object, key value pairs, and that's why I am using these 3 lines of code to create a SQL statement. So I write an insert statement passing in the names of the columns, first name, last name, and the values, Fred Durst, Forrest Gump. We then use a try to create the request. We're establishing a connection using PyMySQL built-in connect. We pass in the host, user, password, database name, connection timeouts. You might have to play around with whatever you set this to. And from there, the connection calls this cursor method, and we then run execute, passing in the SQL from above and the values that we want to pass into the value template. From there, it's going to commit and it's going to close, and that's my code. So if I was to write new code for deleting a row, I would essentially just change my SQL statement to delete, and then I would pass in just the column or the table name if I wanted to do the whole table, or column if I want to just do the columns. Let's see. We have return on success and an exception for errors. And this is where we get to specify the status code and the specific error that occurred if there was one, or the success message if it was successful. And from there, let's say I was ready to get this deployed again. That's where you run a zip command locally, right? So if I wanted to call this deployment package _zip first, I'm going to delete my deployment package, because when I zip this up, I'm going to do a zip bar. I'm going to pass in the name of the zip I want to create. And then I'm just going to select my current working directory, because that's how I like to do it. You could individually select what you want to pass in. You could do it. You could be more fine-tuned about it, basically. But this is how I've been doing it. I also specify lambda function.py. And it's going to select everything inside this parent directory and all subdirectories, and it's going to create a zip file. And you take that zip file back to AWS, and that's where you pass it in again. So if we go back to my create row, let's say I wanted to update this, I would go to upload from, I would select my zip file, and hit save. It's fairly quick. It's usually quicker than this.
You cursed it. I mean, it's usually quick until you say something there.
Exactly. Should have kept my mouth shut. One thing I want to point out here is you saw, I don't know if you saw, but the file size was 30 megabytes. It recommends that if it's over 10 megabytes, you use an S3 bucket instead. I think it doesn't even let you upload if it's beyond 50 megs. Once that's done, I would just go back to test my code. So that is your basic flow. It succeeded. And where it can get tricky, unless you're smart like Chad and you're very methodical about how you set up your layers, is where you set up your layers. So setting up a layer, it's not the most intuitive thing because first you're going to have to create a layer, but there's no button to create a layer. You go to add a layer, and that's where you will see in fine print an option to create a new layer. So when you create a new layer, this is where you will upload the zip file for whatever you were going to create. So like, let's say in my case, I'm going to go switch back to VS Code just so you could visualize this. Let's say because I am trying to upload, what is it called? PyMySQL, I would simply do zip. Let's say I want to name it PyMySQL -layer.zip. And then I would point it to the directory that has the PyMySQL, the necessary package files, basically. And once that's zipped up, I can pass that into my Lambda. And now it will be accessible from my environment. Chad, when you do it this way, your import statement can be very simple, right? Like you just say import this package. You don't have to say import from. You don't have to specify where you want to import it from, right?
I'm gonna pull everything up. I'm working on getting it a little organized. I don't want to just answer until I verify that, but it is simple.
Okay. Yeah. And in my case, the way that you saw me package this, I just selected the folder directly. So I didn't have that folder nested into subdirectories. If you do, you might have to change the import setting to be more specific, but that's where your mileage will vary. It's going to boil down to essentially how you set it up locally and then how you decide you want to push this out. Any questions on any of that?
It's for sure something you need to practice. Just do it. It's going to be really weird, but it's kind of cool. I'll show you guys later what I got going with it. Because then you can use this instead of EC2 instances for certain kinds of things. APIs are very good for this. So yeah, and so it's a way to use these because you get a ton. I can't remember, but you get a lot of Lambda calls every month in the free tier. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So that is essentially everything for our Lambda lesson. This first lesson really just talks about the basics of Lambdas, serverless hierarchies, structures. And this second lesson is a very specific walkthrough of all the steps to do today's challenge. So there's a lot more detail than you may need. But all this information is here depending on how you want to go about writing your Lambdas and deploying them. And then today's challenge is to set up an RDS database and write a few Lambdas. Take a stab at maybe writing a Lambda to even create the database as opposed to having AWS create it for you. And yes, that's actually the last thing that I wanted to show you. So let's go back to AWS. You've already done this, but let me just run through it one more time. When you're creating your RDS, there are some key values that you want to keep in mind. So first, you're going to be selecting what engine you want to use. So in my case, I tried both MySQL and PostgreSQL. Let's say I just select that. Next, you want to select your template. And please only choose an engine that has a free tier available. They don't all have that available. If we go back to Aurora, we'll see that it's gone. So, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see what the estimated costs are if you were to go beyond the free limit. Oof. That's way higher than if we were to go with PostgreSQL, free tier. It goes down from 700 to about $15. And I think and that only kicks in after you go beyond the free tier allocation. Okay, so you select free tier, you set some certain things like your database name. For credentials, you'll probably want to use self-managed, so you could set your own basic password, because all you want to do is be able to connect with MySQL data or MySQL Workbench or pgadmin, or even do it from your terminal if you want, and to be able to connect through the Lambda. From there, you could just choose maybe one of the simplest configurations, leave all the storage values at default, go ahead and turn off a lot of these extra things. You're not going to need auto scaling. You're not going to need advanced monitoring. So we don't need to connect to an EC2 for this challenge. And I think it's good practice to not use the default security group and to use your own, so you have full control over setting up your security rules on your own. So wherever my name is, I would select that. This doesn't really matter. I like to just choose the first one anyway. Then additional configuration, depending on whether you're using MySQL or PostgreSQL, you're going to want to change this accordingly. I think MySQL uses 3306 or something like that. Leave database authentication at password. You don't need to have IAM database authentication. This monitoring we turn off. Same with additional configuration and additional configuration. I think this is one of the last things I want to show you. If you wanted to just have the RDS create a database for you, this is where you would set the name for that. And can we delete the launch wizard? Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll go through and the launch wizard. Was that from Saturday? Overall, you should be deleting as you go, but I'm also, I mean, like, no one's perfect, right? I also have a lot of stuff that I could be deleting. So I'll go through the things I've created and delete any unnecessary things. And I'm going to go ahead and delete, because I've already showed you the demo, I'm going to delete my Lambdas and my RDS database after this. Get rid of backups. I think keep encryption. In my case, I kept encryption so that I could, in the demonstration, write out a section on setting up, what is it called? Ooh, I'm blanking on what it's called. It's another package that is used to basically encrypt and decrypt during the authentication process. So it's optional. You can turn it off if you want. We don't need version upgrading, so you can turn that off. And that's about everything. From there, you can create your database and you should be good to go. Any questions on anything? Nice. Kristen, that makes me wonder, like, have AWS costs ever been brought up when you were in uniform?
No, I don't think so. I got the email last night saying like, oh, you've reached 75% of your free tier. And I was like, what EC2 do I have on my personal account? And then I looked at when it was, and it must have been whenever we learned how to first deploy like our personal projects. And I followed along on the lesson, and I don't think there was anything about like, hey, you should terminate this if you're not going to use it. And so I just never did, and then found out.
Do they have you use your own accounts, or is it like here where we have shared account that you make an IAM profile in?
No, it's all just our own accounts. It's a completely optional to deploy. And I never ended up actually deploying my personal project, but yeah, so for anybody that did, it's all on their personal accounts.
Got it. Okay, so definitely be mindful, especially on your own personal accounts, be mindful of your resources and your budgeting. All right, I am going to cut this recording. I'm going to open up breakout rooms. Go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and let's meet back up at 9 o'clock.